Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me, as always, is Dr. Patrick Wyman. We are ready to discuss the events of UFC Atlantic City, and ahead of us, 3 weeks without UFC action. 3 straight weekends, I think, before our next UFC event, which, if I'm not mistaken, will be UFC 224, which, not the best pay-per-view to look forward to, but really, I think we're looking forward to another vacation, essentially, so shortly after one we had a few weeks ago, Pat. It's going to be fun, and it means we get to kind of stretch our legs here and spend however much time we want discussing the key moments of UFC Atlantic City, and there were quite a few of them. We had a momentous result in the lightweight division in the main event. We saw I think a very telling performance out of Frankie Edgar and Cub Swanson in the co-main, really demonstrating where those guys are at in their careers and where they will still be able to go from here. We have prospects developing themselves. We have longtime veterans surprising us with unexpected finishes. And we have totally insane controversy, the likes of which we have pretty much never seen before in the modern UFC. So lots of stuff to discuss. And then because we don't have an event to preview for next weekend, we are also going to cover a topic at the end of today's show. We're going to talk about weight classes and how tactics differ across the span of weight classes. What is broadly different about fighting at 125 versus fighting at 265 and all the gradations between. So let's start off with UFC Atlantic City, Pat. Kevin Lee, Edson Barboza fought in the main event. Edson Barboza we'll say this, he's getting better at losing by total ground domination.
That's true. I was going to say, before we get into talking about that real quick, it is kind of fitting that we're starting what I would like to call the Heavy Hands spring break over these 3 weeks with a trip to Atlantic City. So just thought that there was some real nice kind of synergy going on there with that.
Very good. Yes. Hopefully we come back from hopefully like some year we get UFC Panama City or some shit like that for the real wild spring break.
UFC Myrtle Beach.
UFC Garden City. I can't wait.
UFC. I'm trying to think. What's the place that all the college kids from Southern California go? Rosarito.
Oh boy.
Yeah, that's not ideal.
No.
Okay, where were we? Yes, Kevin Lee and Edson Barboza. Yeah, I think your comment about Barboza getting better at losing by ground domination is pretty telling, because the problem is not that Edson Barboza does not know how to defend a takedown. It's not that he doesn't know how to grapple. He knows how to do both of those things. The problem is it's all a function of the limitations of his striking game, strangely enough.
Yeah.
It's that when you pressure Edson Barboza, he really only has one thing that he does, which is he tries to stick and move. And he's pretty good at that, but he's not good enough to not get dominated by the very best guys in the division.
Yeah,
at the very best wrestlers and top control grapplers in the division.
I mean, we don't know if there are other ways of doing it, but definitely the pressure on the feet is what got him into the grappling. Like Kevin Lee watched the Khabib fight and said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to fight southpaw. I'm going to push forward, and I'm going to take him down and beat him up. He did exactly what Khabib did to Edson.
Yeah, but in almost, roughly as effectively. It wasn't. Mm-hmm. He wasn't really any less effective at doing that than Khabib was.
No. I would say it looked, just eyeballing it, like he landed more power in the early portions of the bout on the ground. I was impressed with Barboza's toughness against Khabib, but I was shocked that he was not KO'd by some of the shots that landed in the first 2 rounds of this fight on the floor.
Yeah, and this really comes back to a lot of the stuff that we were talking about with Lee last week, where you and I think it has taken us a while to come around on Kevin Lee, just like it has taken Kevin Lee a while to come around.
Yeah.
He has not been a kind of a phenom type bloomer to the extent that it's possible to do that in a division that is as much of a shark tank as lightweight is,
Right.
Like there are no softballs when you come into the UFC's lightweight division, really. And Lee has not gotten booked with softballs ever. Like, it's not like he has gotten a bunch of scrubs that he could kind of run over. His entire career has been a product of learning on the job, learning from camp to camp.
Debuted in the UFC as a very inexperienced fighter against Ally Quinta, if I'm not mistaken.
On short notice.
Yeah, on short notice. So he has been repeatedly been thrown in there against the best of the best from the beginning of his career. I have many times, and this is just for Ben Cohn that I always reference, our listener Ben Cohn, that I always reference Ryan Bader, but he is the best example. We've seen many Ryan Baders over the course of the UFC. It's always nice to see a prospect reap the rewards of those frustrations and losses. Like, it's really great to watch Kevin Lee, to go back now and be like, oh, look at him, he's taking a damn picture after every single punch he lands, and then to watch his striking in this fight, to watch him pushing forward, slipping and countering, working behind a jab, cutting off the cage, fighting effectively out of both stances. Like, it's a new Kevin Lee, and it just took a little while to get there. It took some of those early losses to get there. It's all part of the process, you know? It's nice to see it come to fruition.
Yeah, really it is. I think I'm with you on all of that. Like, the whole him coming out as a southpaw thing, I was like, oh, this seems like the kind of thing you do as kind of a bad follow-up to a loss, where you're like, oh, I've got to switch things up. And then he started throwing, and I thought, oh, no, he's really good. He's really good at that.
Yeah.
He knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
That is, like, the southpaw jab he was throwing it looked like he'd been throwing southpaw jabs his whole life. The right hook he was throwing was, like, a lot of the time when you see a non-southpaw throwing right hooks, it looks kind of weird and looping and ugly because they think it's like people think they're throwing an overhand with their lead hand, you know? His right hook was really nice. It was really tight. It was sharp. His straight left was gorgeous. That left kick, which is probably the best strike he throws, was vicious and on point.
His kicks are hard, man. He was knocking Barboza around, kicking him in the body and the legs. He didn't land a ton of them in this fight, but they're powerful, dude. Like, Kevin Lee might turn into more of a knockout artist than we ever expected. I don't know. He seems to hit pretty damn hard now that he's got a handle on his striking.
Well, so the thing that stands out about that is that he doesn't overthrow his strikes, right? Like, and he never really has. So when he was very early, he did not do the thing that a lot of young and athletically gifted fighters do, where they throw everything into their shots in the hopes of knocking dudes out. Lee, like, very slowly but surely from fight to fight, learned to throw his shots with proper technique, to the point where there was kind of an incongruity between the effect that his punches were having and the look of the guy, because he looks like a beast, and he is a beast. He's incredibly muscular and strong. I'm thinking back to, like, his fights with Michel Prazeres, John Tuck, those kinds of fights, very early in his career, when he would be throwing these what looked like kind of light tapping 1-2s and like light jabs that didn't look like they had a ton behind him. But now that his technique has gotten to the point where he knows when and how to root himself, he knows how to get his hips into his shots. He knows how to really drive with his legs without like, you know, overthrowing or really throwing himself into his shots. All of a sudden, there's just pop in everything he throws.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point. Is there anything we want to say about this performance? Like, it was mostly complete domination. There was a very brief moment, a very exciting moment, when Edson Barboza landed a wheel kick to the side of Lee's head, and his legs turned to water, totally to water. But he recovered very well, got himself back into the fight. Anything about this, like, stand out from a technical perspective?
I think the intelligence of his pressure game. Yeah. Where we saw Khabib really sell out with the pressure against Barboza, and sell out with the pace too, that he was throwing 30 strikes a minute on the feet in his efforts to corral Barboza. He just overwhelmed him. And that worked. It worked really well. We had high praise for that then. We still have high praise for it now as basically the correct thing for Khabib to do to beat Barboza. Lee's approach was much more kind of methodical, and slow paced on the feet, but no less effective. There were only, I could count on one hand the number of times in this fight when Barboza circled away from the fence and it looked like Lee was following him rather than cutting him off. Like, it was really tight, crisp footwork. He used his kicks really well to corral Barboza. He used that southpaw and orthodox jab too, when he was an orthodox jab, really well to push Barboza back even by a step or two, and combine that with the footwork. Yeah. So the jab as a pressure tool is really underrated because it forces your opponent to step back. Right.
Yeah, it seems obvious, but it goes under, especially in MMA. Like, pressure fighters need the jab. It's really, really important. Kevin Lee proved that here.
It gets underused in MMA because the space of the cage is so much bigger, right? So you really have to worry about your opponent, about your opponent's lateral movement more than I think you do in a ring.
Sure.
Where in a ring there are corners. The actual space of the ring is substantially smaller than a cage's. In the octagon, the challenge is really to avoid the lateral movement more than it is to avoid the front and back, because guys aren't as good at maintaining distance anyway in MMA. Like it's just not as necessary. But we saw the benefits of a pressure jab in this fight from Lee. Because not only did he take care of the lateral aspects with that right hook and the left, and especially the left kick, but also he did a really good job of forcing Barboza back. And you could hear Mark Henry in Barboza's corner losing his mind. But I really think that's because of the jab. I think it was just that Barboza was not prepared to have Lee's lead hand in his face the whole time.
Yeah, Barboza, he does not like being pressured so heavily. Like he has very effective footwork if you're in a boxing match with him. I think we said this last week, but he did give Lee a relatively easy time of pressuring him in that he would take such large movements to get away that he would constantly be putting himself against the cage or rounding the perimeter rather than moving back to the center of the octagon. But like you could maybe say that Khabib's style is maybe the more appropriate approach for Edson Barboza. Like Khabib had no moments in retrospect in which he was really badly hurt. I don't think Edson landed the kind of shots on Khabib he landed on Kevin Lee here. Even in just moments, Edson was landing some big counters at times. But in the long haul, I think Kevin Lee's approach here is better than Khabib's. If we're looking at somebody developing a style that will work for them down the road for a long time, understanding how a pressure fighting style works, how to slip, how to keep your eyes on your opponent, how to position yourselves in front of them. Like Khabib's pressure is very intuitive and very wild. And like Kevin Lee fought a really smart, methodical fight. And knowing that he had 5 rounds instead of the 3 that Khabib had against Edson, I think was a very smart way to was a good reason to do what he did and kind of fight at a slightly more measured pace.
Well, one of the things that's really striking to me about Lee now, this was his 13th fight in the UFC.
That's
like
crazy.
He's gotten a lot of experience in the UFC. He fought 3 times in 2014, 3 times in 2015, 3 times in 2016, 3 times in 2017, and this was his first fight of 2018. He's had a lot of experience here. But what we've seen from him, when you come up in a shark tank of a division like this, where you're confronted with a lot of really different kinds of challenges. I mean, he fought Marcel Prajerish, he fought Jake Matthews, he fought Magomed Mustafayev, he fought Michael Chiesa, he fought Tony Ferguson. Like, he has fought a lot of different kinds of guys. But that means when you approach each of those opponents pretty intelligently, when you're well coached, when this has happened over a stretch of time, when you've just been in the gym consistently, you get a lot of versatility out of your game. And I think that's what we're seeing from Lee now as he kind of moves into, or kind of strategic versatility, I should say. Like, from a technical perspective, he's really meat and potatoes. It's jabs, crosses, hooks, round kicks, and kind of an array of takedowns. Like, there's nothing especially complicated about what he does, but the way that he applies it, the game plans that he is capable of going to, that's in a division like this, if you're going to succeed at the highest levels, that kind of versatility is really necessary because you're not going to get, matchups with pure boxer punchers all the time. You're not going to get matchups with pure outfighters all the time. You're not going to get matchups with grind you wrestlers. Like, there's a lot of, you're going to be faced with a lot of different situations, both tactically and strategically, and you're going to have to adapt. You're going to have to be adaptable, and Lee is proving himself to be supremely adaptable.
Yeah, and you could maybe argue that, like, having such a meat and potatoes kind of game, especially on the feet, is why he's so adaptable. That if you build your game like Edson Barboza, you spend the early parts of your career learning to throw a wheel kick and spending tons of time perfecting that technique. What kind of fighter are you going to be? What kind of game does that technique really fit into if you're building yourself around a kicking game in general? Lee is just like he's super meat and potatoes, but he seems like he can do a lot and much better than we ever really expected up to this point. He can.
Yeah, he's a reminder that a career for a top flight kind of prospect, which Lee was, is a marathon and not a sprint. You're like, Lee got into the UFC in 2014. In like February of 2014 as a 22-year-old, 21-year-old. He was 21 when he debuted in the UFC. And he had been fighting as a pro for just shy of 2 years. That means that Lee, in all likelihood, is going to be in the UFC until 2024 or 2025. You're looking at a guy who gets in that young, who's going to have 25 or 30 fights in the UFC.
It's crazy.
Unless he ends up going somewhere else. But like, if he stays in the UFC his whole career, he's gonna be around for 30-ish fights, like Jim Miller style. Jim Miller had his 29th fight on this card.
Yeah,
29th UFC fight.
Yeah,
like Lee is shaping up to have a kind of a similar stretch of career, and it's just a reminder that you're going to grow a lot in that time. And I think that's kind of a thread that we're going to see over and over as we talk about the fights on this card.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's definitely more to be said about like the specifics of Kevin Lee's ground game, but as you've just alluded to, we will have much more time to discuss the particulars of Kevin Lee's game, hopefully in the very near future, if he keeps up this busy schedule too. So hopefully we'll be able to get more into like, I do want someday we'll have a special we can talk about. Maybe we'll have Luke Thomas back on or something and talk about the particulars of the ground and pound and grappling games of guys like Khabib and Kevin Lee, how they get that to work. But speaking of people who don't have a lot of time left to discuss, Frankie Edgar fought in the co-main event, and I'll admit, Pat, I was quite nervous for Frankie going into this fight, not just because of the knockout loss to Brian Ortega, which was only like 30, 40-something days ago, a little less than 2 months, I think. But then, like 2 weeks before this or whatever, his father died. Apparently his grandfather died this week. He's 36 now. Like, he's surely reaching the end of his time at the top, and is already on the downslide. I think you can see that looking at his performances. I was concerned that even though the first fight, he won the first fight with Cub Swanson so handily, there was just too much pressure on him here. And Frankie Edgar is the fucking king of operating under pressure. He just didn't give a shit. He fought an excellent fight against Cub Swanson, a different one than the first time in many ways, but an excellent fight nonetheless.
Yeah. What's really striking to me, or what was really striking to me watching this fight, was how Swanson and Edgar, both of whom are kind of in the last stage of their prime careers, about the differences in how they're adapting as they get older. Not that Swanson's adaptations have been bad. Swanson has adapted by getting way quicker paced, by throwing way more as the years have gone on. For the most part, that's been his response. It's easy to forget given how the Ortega fight ended, but Swanson was absolutely lighting him up. He absolutely lit up Artem Lobov in that fight too. That was contested at an incredibly high pace. That has more or less been Swanson's adjustment as time has gone on. Frankie Edgar really has gone the opposite direction, from being a guy who just threw tons and tons and tons of volume early in his career, often without much accuracy and usually without much behind it. Frankie has become a much more rooted puncher and has replaced a lot of that kind of meaningless volume that was there to be countered by good counterpunchers, as we saw a number of times, with the suggestion of volume and the suggestion of work rate and more feints and things to draw out the shots that he actually wants to throw and land. And that was on full display here. I thought that was really striking.
Mm-hmm. He's in the cut the shit stage of his career, essentially, where it's like Frankie Edgar can't be bothered to do all this running around anymore. It makes him tired now. His old bones hurt, Pat. But
so real quick. So Ben Folks and Chad Dundas of the Co-Main Event podcast, which you should listen to if you don't.
Never heard.
They have a kind of a recurring bit about Frankie Edgar where really he's just like an old guy sitting in his recliner reading a newspaper with a pair of reading glasses on, and then the fight announcement comes in and he very carefully takes off his reading glasses and like, oh, okay, I guess I'll sign.
Folds the newspaper very neatly, takes his slippers off.
Exactly. You've got the image exactly.
Oh, yeah, it's perfect. It's perfect. It doesn't quite gel with the idea that Frankie Edgar seems to have gotten much meaner as he's gotten older, rather than like having gotten greater decorum. The thing is the effect of, maybe my stamina is not quite as good, maybe this, but also just like, I don't know, realizing I'm not quite as fast as I was. All this stuff is a little more difficult to make work. The effect of that is like a power punching Frankie Edgar. And I mean, we were all shocked when Frankie knocked out Chad Mendes, and I'm not expecting a lot of Frankie Edgar knockouts from here until the eventual end of his career, but he was landing some goddamn heat on Cub Swanson's chin in the early portions of this fight. When he was pressing forward and throwing that right hand, that was not the right hand you were expecting if you were watching Frankie Edgar at 155, or even a few years ago at 145. That was Frankie Edgar with his feet planted, as you said, rooted, in position to throw power, and like so confident that he doesn't need the bullshit anymore. Now there's this real deliberateness to Frankie Edgar's boxing that there are still strikes that aren't intended to land, but they're very, very purposeful. It's not just like a swarm of all kinds of stuff going on, so you can't tell what's happening. It's like, okay, I'm going to pump the jab in his face and move forward and crack him with a shot. Everything's very, very deliberate and going towards, I don't know, it's like by adding this has allowed Frankie Edgar to become a much more effective pressure fighter, which I think is good, because he's at a stage in his career where he can't just use speed and stamina as his main weapons to force opponents to deal with the switch-up aspect of his game. Now he can use pressure to make you deal with the fact that you don't know what he's going to do next. You can't tell what he's going to transition to, and you have to deal with it because he's in your face.
This was something we talked about a lot after the Ortega fight, where, aside from the finish in that, which was stunning, and, huge props to Brian Ortega for that, what immediately jumped out at both of us in the aftermath of that was how hard Frankie was hitting Ortega and how much pop he had on his shots. And so I went back and I rewatched the Yair Rodriguez fight because I was trying to figure out, when did this happen? And I really think, in hindsight, after watching that fight, that part of what put Rodriguez so far off his game, part of why he kind of crumbled in the face of Frankie's pressure, was that he wasn't expecting Frankie to hit him as hard as he did. And when Frankie landed a few good shots, which is more or less what opened up his wrestling, and when Frankie was getting aggressive and really coming after him, I don't think he was expecting it to feel the way that it did, And I think that is why Rodriguez kind of crumbled and made the bad decisions that he made over the course of that fight. Was just, he was not quite expecting that. We didn't see that against Jeremy Stephens, I think because because Frankie was injured, and B, that was a little earlier on. It definitely wasn't there in that Aldo fight. It's really only in Frankie's last 3 fights that we've seen him rooted like this, like really driving and turning his hip over into the shots that he throws, and really landing shots at the sweet spot, like right at the perfect spot in the arc of the punch to have the maximum kind of force. We've seen that now in a few fights, and I think it's really going to be the hallmark of what drives him through this next stage of his career.
Yeah, I mean, it's still risky business. Like it's a more dangerous game that Frankie is playing now than he was earlier in his career, because he has had to make that adaptation. He still does not have much head movement at all. There are still moments when I watch Frankie Edgar coming forward behind that jab, or when I watched him throwing that lead left hook, which is the shot that got him countered by Ortega. It does make me a little nervous. His head stays right there. He just moves in with his feet, and he is there to be picked off. And that has really been, like, the story of Frankie Edgar's career is getting countered hard, is getting hit while throwing. That's when he's vulnerable. But he's also he's just a lot more calm in the pocket too. So what defensive options he does have, he can grab them a lot more easily.
Yeah, but I was going to ask you about that. Didn't it seem like his head movement was more purposeful here against Swanson?
All the defense is more purposeful. Going back to that Jeremy Stephens fight too, like that wasn't a power punching performance, but you can watch that again, and like Frankie Edgar is in pocket picking shots off and slipping and rolling under punches very, very deliberately in a way that he never has before.
Yeah, because I was gonna mention this. I'm glad that you brought this up, because I was gonna say the downside to Edgar's approach is that he is in range more often than he used to be. Yeah. He is there to be hit a lot more. But the flip side to that is that he is much harder to hit in those ranges than he was 3 or 4 years ago.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Like, you watch the way Aldo just absolutely took him apart with counters in their second fight. Just really picked and chose exactly the shots that he wanted whenever he wanted them there. I still think Aldo would beat him if they were to fight for a third time, but Frankie is not as available in those ranges as he used to be. And I thought he did a real good job in this fight, as good a job as you could expect, against a very accurate puncher. Like, it's hard to overstate. Like, Cub throws more than he used to, but he still picks and chooses and places his shots very carefully and very nicely. It's the best part of Cub Swanson's game, is that he puts his shots exactly where he wants them to go. And he had a lot of trouble landing those shots. He landed some good ones, as he always will. You can't underestimate Cub Swanson, but he had a lot more trouble than he would have 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. Speaking of Aldo, like, I'll just say this before we move on. It's kind of funny that Jose Aldo had Frankie Edgar 1, and then he suffered a terrible loss much later, and then he came back and reminded us of who he was with Frankie Edgar 2. We're like, oh, holy shit, I forgot Jose Aldo. I mean, I didn't forget. I didn't forget, but everyone else who forgot was quickly reminded of how scintillatingly good Jose Aldo really is. And Frankie Edgar had like the same thing with Cub Swanson. He had the first fight with Cub Swanson. He dominated it. It wasn't like, I don't know, maybe it was more impressive than Aldo's first win over Edgar and that it was more complete. But then he comes back after this first terrible knockout loss of his career to Brian Ortega and fights Cub Swanson again. And it's like, oh, in getting to see the same style matchup and in getting to see how he adjusts to taking it on a second time, it's a nice reminder of like, oh, Frankie Edgar is one of the best fighters ever.
Yeah, he's like he's probably definitely in the top 10 and very probably in the top 5.
He might be. Yeah, he's up there, man. All-time great, no doubt.
So, moving on, next segment, what do we got coming?
Next up, we have, let's see, we're going to talk about Aljamain Sterling and his fight with Brett Johns, a little bantamweight feature that was maybe the best performance of Aljo's career. We'll talk about that. And then a crazy back-and-forth war that had pretty much every aspect of MMA happening at every moment all the time. Ricky Simone is how they were pronouncing it. I thought it was Ricky Simon, but Ricky Simone versus Merab Dvalishvili, which also had a very strange and kind of scary and controversial ending. So we'll talk about all of that after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's go ahead and keep talking about UFC Atlantic City. As promised, Aljamain Sterling versus Brett Johns is next on the docket. This was, well, I guess we'll start the discussion here. I said before the end of last segment, this was maybe the best Aljamain Sterling we've ever seen overall. Would you agree with that statement?
I would definitely say that, yeah. I thought he looked real good. I think we kind of saw what his mature style is going to look like in this fight.
Yeah. Everything came together. So let's talk about like what that entailed. Brett Johns, first things first, Brett Johns fought a pretty good fight here. I thought there were problems that he could not overcome. He was put in positions that he couldn't deal with, but a lot of that had to do with the way Aljamain Sterling chose to fight him and the way Aljamain Sterling approached him as an opponent. I thought Brett Johns did pretty much everything you might expect a relatively young and inexperienced but very skilled and physically capable fighter to do. He just learned some lessons in this fight, which is nice. It's nice to see Aljamain Sterling not just like completely dominating someone on the ground in the way that you're like, okay, they just couldn't grapple with him or whatever. It's nice to see Aljamain Sterling teaching a younger fighter some lessons in a fight, like showing him this is how you fight when you know what you're doing. This is how you bring every aspect of your game together into a nice, complete performance in which you minimize risk and you just comfortably win a fight. That was that kind of performance.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing that I've noticed here, and it really stands out when you look at Sterling's fight metric page. The margins by which he has won his last three victories. So over Johns, over Renan Barão, and over Augusto Mendes. Like, he has really beat the shit out of those guys.
Yeah,
like,
it's true.
Really has piled up damage and volume over the course of the fight to the point where there should be very little doubt about who won them. Even the Asuncao fight, like, Asuncao landed probably the cleaner, harder headshots, but Sterling substantially outlanded him in that fight.
Mm-hmm. And as the fight went on, too, he definitely picked up the volume and started to land more and more, which has kind of been the case. And I mean, he didn't land more and more in this fight because he spent much of the third round clinching, but he does tend to get more the thing is like Sterling can be a fighter who gasses, but when he doesn't gas now, he just gets better as the fight goes on.
Yeah, well, he hasn't really gassed since that Caraway fight.
True.
That's really the only time that's ever happened to him. But what you see from Sterling, I think, is a game that is starting to fit together and is starting to make sense. He's always been a smart guy. He's always had a lot of ideas, to the point where it seems fairly clear that there were fights early in his career. And I remember this from, interactions that I had with him back in like 2013, 2014, where like he probably thought too much about things. And so there was a stage in his career, I would say the Caraway of Sun South phase, where he was thinking about things way more than he needed to. And
yeah, it was like really early on, he felt like he could do anything, so he just kind of did anything. And then as he went on, it was like he realized how much more things there were to do, and then he stopped doing anything because he was like overwhelmed by the options available. Now he's found his place as a fighter. He's found where he sits in the technical spectrum.
Exactly. And so you see the game that he's crafted for himself, where he is basically an outfighter. He wants to pick his shots on the outside. He's showed off a much better jab over his last few fights, which means that it used to be just kicks and then combinations in the pocket. And when he didn't feel comfortable throwing combinations in the pocket, it was just kicks or clinching. And now he's managing to fill in those middle ranges of his game. So he's got the rangy kicks, he's got the round kicks, he's got the jab, then he's got the layer of straight punches and hooks before that, and then he's got the clinch. Right. So he's really managed to develop tools for himself at every range. It doesn't mean he's equally comfortable at all those, but his sense for where he is and what he can throw at any given time means that he wastes less energy throwing bullshit than he used to.
Even when he's throwing kind of wild punches from time to time, he's not wasting energy. The form might be off. Like, you could critique the efficiency of a lot of what Aljamain Sterling does and the advisability of some of it, but it doesn't seem to bother him because, I don't know, this is what I really want to talk about here is I do want to talk a little bit about Sterling and the clinch and on the ground, but the striking is obviously the area of most improvement for him since his UFC debut. And I just want to talk about how deliberate he is as a striker now. Like, he still looks a little wild. Everything can look a little frantic from time to time when he really starts putting a lot of stuff together, but there's a thing I kind of look for when I'm like evaluating somebody's defense or something that stands out that makes me say, oh, this guy's got good defense, or he's got a good feel for defense at least. And it's like these little moments where a fighter will wait after making a defensive move, where everything is not automatic. You have guys who get surprised by shit all the time and don't move their heads. Then you have guys who do move their heads and do catch and parry and block shots, but they kind of do it automatically. You hit them with the right, and they automatically cover for the left hook next. You can surprise them if you can change things up. And then you have the guys who are really using, their eyes to choose their defensive reactions. Things still are automatic in the sense that they don't have to think about them a great deal, which is good for a guy like Aljo. But you kind of are selecting your moves from a shortened list of options after making a move beforehand. So when you see Sterling slip a jab and then he keeps his eyes on Brett Johns and he waits for the hook to come after and then he rolls under and takes an angle to the side, there was a lot of that in this fight where Sterling, like, his eyes really impressed me. He was very, very aware, maybe hyper aware after that Marlon Moraes fight, but he was very, very aware of what might be coming back at him and responding really well to the threats throughout the fight.
Yeah, I noticed that. It was really, really striking. And as he was doing that, too, his defense was connected to his offense, right? Like, he was picking his spots to stand and counter. And so it's not – he did a great job of seeing shots coming, but it wasn't just that. He was hyper aware of the range and where he was at. So when he was exchanging with Johns, he wasn't exchanging with his back close to the fence, right? It wasn't like he was planting his feet and just throwing to try to keep Johns off him or anything like that. It was when he knew he had space to retreat. It was when he knew he had angles available to him to get out of there. And he knew that he was exchanging on his terms. So when it got a little bit wild, those exchanges really went his way. And you could see the math playing out in Sterling's head. He's like, okay, this guy can't reach me from here. I can reach him, which means that I can probably hit him with 3 or 4 punches. And if I eat one, well, then I've got room to get out of here before this gets too hairy. And that was really good to see from him because we've seen him exchange before. We've seen him counter before with greater and lesser degrees of effectiveness. But what was new here was that math that you could see playing out for him where he's like, okay, he is not a guy who likes getting hit. right? He's not like some blood curdling kind of dude who just wants to get in there and make it and like just bang it out in the pocket. That is not Sterling. It never has been, and it never will be.
He won't be inheriting the Carlos Condit throne anytime soon.
Yeah, that's not who he is, and he doesn't have to be. That's not going to be all fighters. What is Sterling's thing is figuring out what are the spots where I can make it wild and bloody while still having the balance tilted well in my favor.
Yeah.
And you could see him doing that here, where Johns is not a bad pocket puncher. Johns is actually a pretty good pocket puncher and knows how to put combinations together. And Sterling knew that, drew that out, and picked spots where he was going to be the one who had the advantage in those exchanges.
Mm-hmm. So by the end of the fight, like if somebody was throwing and landing 5 or 6 punches in a row, it was Aljamain Sterling, not Brett Johns.
Yeah.
Where he started to light Johns up a little bit, at least in just brief flashes. I do want to talk about, though, you mentioned just then, this is kind of like, it's all about Aljamain Sterling's decision-making, or like choosing his battles. Like, I think that is the skill that stands out as well. Something that Aljamain Sterling has clearly improved on is choosing his battles. He looks more like a veteran now. He got, he selected when to exchange with Brett Johns, such that, like, for a guy who clearly doesn't love being hit, he didn't really look worried about being hit at any moment. Anytime he was vulnerable to be hit in those exchanges, he knew he was vulnerable. He'd only exchanged when he had accepted that fact. So he went in there at peace. He went into the pocket at peace and willing to take a shot if he needed to. Likewise, he kept forcing Brett Johns to fight specific clinch battles with him. Like he had a lot of time and clinch control in this fight, and it's like I noticed he kept forcing Johns to fight these little tactical battles in the clinch. Really what Brett Johns needed was to get the hell out of the clinch. Or if he was going to be there, put Sterling against the fence. Like get into a dominant position, change position. But Johns spent so much time with his back against the fence because he would, Sterling would change angles, and then he would focus really hard on like preventing the underhook. And so Johns would get really focused on getting that underhook. And then he would get it, and then Sterling would adjust and get a dominant position in a different way and give Johns a different thing to focus on. Okay, now I'm wrapping your leg with my legs. Now you got to move your hips to adjust to that. Every time that Brett Johns would win a little tactical battle or force a stalemate, Sterling was still in a position of control. The whole time he was just fighting Sterling's fight.
Even remember when that one time when Johns manages to turn Sterling around on the fence and he's like, okay, I got to get him down. I have to get a takedown here. Sterling kind of lets him spin him around and then very deliberately digs for double underhooks. And then as Johns is kind of desperately trying to get his hands together with his hips way too high, Sterling elevates him with those double underhooks and lands like 3 vicious knees right to the solar plexus, where he didn't immediately dig into those underhooks, right? He kind of slipped those underhooks in there and waited and let Johns burn a little bit more energy. And then when Johns starts to realize the trouble he's in, then Sterling throws the knees, right? Like it's little things like that that speaks to the kind of dude that Sterling has become. Now, when you look at the aggregate of Sterling's career more than any individual fight or any individual exchange, you see the style of a guy who's going to get better as time goes on and has continued to get better because he barely gets hit. Like he had that very public knockout loss to Marlon Moraes, kind of a knockout of the year candidate. But other than that, the dude has barely taken any damage.
It's true.
He gets 1.43 strikes absorbed per minute. That's about as low as you can possibly get.
Yeah. And it's clear that defense, like striking defense, is a big focus of his. It's the one thing that has really, really come along since he started. Yeah, that's a very good point. I hadn't really considered how infrequently, like, cause it's like you're being controlled by him or you can't hit him. And now he's getting better and better at being difficult to hit no matter what kind of fight he's having or at what range.
And so that raises the question because, and this is unfortunately kind of always the question with Sterling because you see the talent, and you see the progression. And you're like, okay, well, what's the ceiling? What's he going to end up doing? That's the question people have been asking about Sterling since he got labeled the next John Jones in like 2012. It's always been what's the future for him as opposed to just kind of appreciating the fact that he's a pretty solid top 6 bantamweight right now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's always going to have problems with the guys at the very top, with guys who can be versatile on the feet and take apart that kind of deliberate defense of his. I think like guys like Dillashaw, Garbrandt to a lesser extent.
Dillashaw is a nightmare. It's like I think it's really the pressure and the combinations of strikes coming together like that, the variety. Because Sterling does really like his head movement, and I appreciate it. I love good head movement, and there's far too little of it in MMA. But he's not. He's still not the kind of fighter who will just like sit on his bike behind a jab. And stay nice and balanced and keep moving and just keep everything nice and easy and flowy. It's still very dramatic, rolling, slipping under, landing a big counter. I think he would get into too many mix-ups with Dillashaw, whether he wanted to or not.
Yeah. Guys like that are going to be nightmares for him. And guys like Garbrandt, who are incredibly accurate and powerful punchers, are also going to continue to be a problem there. And we saw that with Marlon Moraes too. Same deal. A hyper accurate, precise striker.
There were some moments in this fight, Pat, where Sterling would be like pulling back with his head right on the center line, and Johns was getting so close, but had lost the confidence to keep letting his hands go. I'm like, man, Cody Garbrandt would have decked him with a straight right hand over that shoulder.
Just taking his head clean off at the shoulders. Yeah. But that's also something we talked about as one of Johns' limitations, which is the kind of athleticism and physicality. And we can come back to that in a minute. But like when you're looking at kind of the landscape of the bantamweight division, it's unfortunate for Sterling's skill sets as they stand that the top 5 of this division is basically all dudes with really problematic, who match up really problematically with Aljo. You know, it's got like guys like Dillashaw and Garbrandt. Dominic Cruz would be interesting. I would not mind seeing that.
He called Cruz out, right? I think he made the right choice. I think he did. If you're going to call out a top guy as Aljamain Sterling, Dominic Cruz seems like the right choice, and that sounds like a very interesting matchup.
Yeah, I mean, Asuncao, same deal. We already saw that fight, and I think Sterling would maybe win a split decision if they fought right now, as opposed to losing a split. But Jimmy Rivera too. Aljo's hope there would basically be hope it's a 5-round fight and hope that you can make it to you make it to the 3rd round, and then try to win the last 3 because the first 2 are going to be rough. Yeah, for you there,
no doubt.
Lineker, I think Sterling probably wins that fight, but he's going to eat a lot of shots that he doesn't want to eat. Dodson, Sterling probably beats at this point. I don't know. What do you think? I'm of two minds about that because on the one hand, powerful, accurate puncher. On the other hand, doesn't do much, and Sterling does a lot.
Yeah, I don't know. You know how like there was a brief moment in John Dodson's career where he kind of redeemed himself for me and was like, okay, I get what he's going for now, and it's finally coming together. It hasn't really happened. So I still find it mesmerizingly difficult to make a clear predictions of John Dodson's fights. Like even when I make predictions correctly, the fight is so much closer than I expected. So I don't know. I desperately don't want to see Aljamain Sterling versus John Dodson. For some reason, I feel like that fight would be immensely frustrating. No matter what happens. I think it could be
immensely frustrating from both sides.
Yes, absolutely.
Like where it's Sterling kind of landing low kicks and landing low kicks. Yes. And then Dodson kind of slower than he used to be, rushes in, Sterling grabs underhooks, pushes him to the fence and controls him for 35 seconds. And then Dodson circles for 30 seconds and doesn't throw anything while Sterling lands like 4 leg kicks.
It sounds amazing. I changed my mind.
I mean, I think I accurately described what that fight would look like though, right?
Oh, yeah.
Dodson swinging and missing with a couple of shots, landing 1, Sterling landing 4 leg kicks, pushing him to the fence, landing 2 knees to the body. Then they break. Dodson lands like 4 punches around.
That's the problem. I can picture the fight. The question is who wins it. I have no idea.
It's Sterling by split decision.
Okay.
And Dodson gets really mad on social media and says, I landed all the shots that mattered. And wash, rinse, and repeat.
All right. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, but this is kind of thing. So we're trying to figure out, okay, who does Sterling fight after this? Well, we've the championship fight is booked. Cruz does not have an opponent, right?
I don't think so. And he called out Cruz. That's the one I want to see, man. I think that sounds like a great fight.
I really want to see Frankie Edgar fight Dominic Cruz at 140-pound catchweight. That's the fight that I want to see. But I would also like to see Aljo Cruz. I mean, so Asuncao is fighting Rob Font, and it could not be clearer that they don't want Asuncao anywhere near a title shot.
Yeah. Poor bastard.
Yeah.
I mean, I get it. Then he's not fun to watch, but come on. He's really good.
I mean, maybe if Jimmy Rivera beats Marlon Moraes, he probably gets a title shot. So that fight's probably out. The winner of that fight probably gets a title shot. But so it's kind of a weird spot to be in for Sterling.
Probably Sterling Cruz, or like I would also like to see Sterling Lineker, if not in his next fight, then at some point. Like as a style matchup, it favors Lineker, but technically and mentally, in many ways, I think it favors Sterling. I think he could outthink Lineker and beat him, but Lineker would be the kind of guy to capitalize on some of those brief errors.
Yeah, Lineker is fighting Brian Kelleher at UFC 224. So if he beats Kelleher, not a given, but I think Lineker probably wins that fight.
Yeah. Or let Sterling fight Kelleher and get a submission win, because that will definitely happen if they fight.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what would happen.
That's how Brian Kelleher loses.
Yeah, it would. Yeah, Sterling eats a shot or two he doesn't want to eat. Kelleher shoots an ill-advised takedown. Sterling sprawls out on a front headlock, gets to his back, or chokes him out with like an anaconda.
Yeah, it would definitely be Kelleher willingly grappling with Sterling too. That would lead to it.
It's funny. Like some of these fights, you can just see exactly how they go down, and yeah,
that's why I love middleweight, because you can imagine every fight that goes down, and every time you're shocked it hasn't happened yet. Final thing. This one we might have to spend a couple minutes on this, but Ricky Simone and Merab Dvalishvili had a fight on the undercard. It was, we could talk a lot about what happened in the fight. It was really, really fun to watch live. It was like Merab Dvalishvili, I described this on Twitter. I said, imagine if Justin Gaethje learned to box off the back foot and then fought a perfect round. Like that was the first round of this fight for Merab Dvalishvili, throwing insane heat. Like reckless abandon, letting every shot go with full power, huge misses that would have exhausted virtually any other fighter. Speaking of the athleticism at bantamweight, like just missing the way Dvalishvili did in this fight would have exhausted most other fighters. And keeping that pace going, also pressing the wrestling the way Justin Gaethje should more, and but also counterpunching and moving his feet really well and just mixing things up and being really interesting to watch. But really, the finish of this fight is the weird thing that I felt like we had to address. Because, I don't know, how did you feel watching? Can you describe to our listeners, because I'm sick of hearing my own voice, can you describe to our listeners, Pat, what happened at the end of this fight?
I can do my best. I'm not sure it's going to fully get it across. So Dvalishvili shoots for a takedown, leaves his head a little too far in on the slam. As Simon is trying for like a guillotine, as Dvalishvili is looking for the takedown. Dvalishvili slams his head onto the mat.
Yeah.
And now remember, Simone has his neck. He's got him in a guillotine. So he kind of rolls him over into a mounted guillotine, which Simone just jacks for everything his life's worth. And then Simone transitions from the two-arm guillotine to the one-arm mounted guillotine, where you use your free hand as a post to increase your leverage on it. Dvalishvili's face turned a color that I have never seen somebody's face turn in a fight before, where it looked like a corpse. It looked like a pallid corpse face, so there was no blood left in his head. It was past like the purple head, like Brock Lesnar after suplexing somebody 17 times face. It was the death mask.
It was when the purple starts to lose some of the red in it, and it just becomes this cold blue. It was very weird.
Yeah, I can honestly say I have never seen that before. And the ref is checking, and Dvalishvili appears to be there, and he's kind of moving his arm when the ref gets him to move his arm, and Dvalishvili is kicking the whole time, and so it gets to the final bell, and then I don't really understand what happened next. I don't understand how they reached the conclusion that they reached, because they called the fight a TKO at 5 minutes of the third round, which I don't understand. I really fundamentally don't get it.
So somebody did point out a nice parallel to this, because I was looking for some. The only thing I could think of was Lyoto Machida knocking out Thiago Silva at the very final second of the third round of their fight, or whatever round that was, but knocking him out to the point that Yves Lavigne did not stop the fight or call it until 2 or 3 seconds after the bell, because he had to look to see that Silva was out. But it was pointed out on Twitter. And again, I apologize to these people that are not anonymous when they give me these tweets, but become anonymous very quickly as I forget who told me. Jeremy Horn versus Chuck Liddell won. Jeremy Horn submitted Chuck Liddell with an arm triangle from the bottom, and Chuck was there, looked like he was struggling. The fight was stopped. As Horn released, it became clear that Liddell was incapacitated, and so the fight was ruled a submission, a technical submission, or a TKO, which I don't really think there's actually a practical difference. So that's the same thing that happened here.
But that wasn't at the very end of the fight, right?
It was at the end of a round.
Yeah, but is there a difference between it being the end of the third round and being the end of any other round? This is the kind of shit that confuses me.
I don't know. Like, the thing is if you retroactively determine, this is the weird thing, is that there's a very good chance that Dvalishvili was out that whole time.
Or at least for substantial segments of that whole time.
Or that he was drifting in and out throughout that and was largely moving his legs automatically, which is not something I've ever seen. Somebody doing such a dramatic and large movement, but like you've definitely seen boxers get knocked out and they're like punching half consciously. We saw Holly Holm doing her silly arm flailing when she was getting submitted by Miesha Tate. We've seen plenty of bizarre involuntary movements. It's really strange that somebody would be bicycle kicking the whole time for like a 45-second segment of time in which they're being strangled. But
we've seen people tap with their feet in exactly that position. You remember we saw Joe Benavidez versus Tim Elliott.
Yeah.
When Benavidez hit that mounted guillotine and Elliott tapped with his feet. Mm-hmm. But Dvalishvili did not appear to have been tapping.
No.
So I can honestly say I've never seen anything like that before.
And like it's really hard to tell how conscious he was. Like I don't know. He was moving his legs. His arms were completely flat on the ground. But then when the referee grabbed his glove to check if his arm was limp, he gave a thumbs up. So was he asleep and then he responded to the touch on his hand? I don't know. But then the choke gets released. He's out and his legs keep moving, which is a really big tell that he's not there. That his one leg keeps pumping after the choke is let go. It's like, okay, there's no reason to be doing that. But then a second and a half after that, he starts like talking shit to Ricky Simone, who's getting off of him and like saying something about how he's out. He starts protesting. So he's aware, but how aware? Was it a situation where he was just like mentally focusing on the movement of his legs to keep himself alive? Like just giving himself something to do that was just, I don't know.
That's what I mean is I can honestly say I have never, in the thousands and thousands of fights that I've watched, I have never seen a sequence like this.
Yeah, it was really strange. I'm glad he didn't die. Like, honestly, I was worried that we were seeing something awful or that there might even be some serious post-fight effects. Because if he was actually being strangled that whole time, being choked that whole time, that's a long time to go without substantial oxygen to your brain.
Yeah, seriously.
So I'm glad that he's okay, and presumably his face is back to the normal color, and I hope so, and we can all move on. But
it was a hell of a fight.
It was a great fight.
It was an insane fight.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal fight, like another bantamweight showcase to show what this division is so good at. But I'm glad everything turned out correctly. I think there is a real justification for the win going to Ricky Simone, but more importantly, I'm glad that Merab Dvalishvili is alive and well. So let's wrap up this segment. When we come back, we are going to talk about weight classes and how tactics change from one to the other, how your size affects the way you fight and the way you should fight after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Now we're going to talk about weight classes and their effects on the way that fighters fight. Now, to kick this topic off, Pat, there's something I have noticed through careful study, which is that the fighters at heavyweight weigh more than the fighters at flyweight, sometimes by a considerable margin. And this does mean that the fights up there look very different than the fights down below. We're going to talk about the reasons why that is, but I thought we would start this off by just sort of listing what changes physically as a result of the size disparity between a small fighter and a big fighter. What are the physical attributes that are affected primarily by a fighter's size?
Well, so I think speed is the big one.
Yeah.
Speed, strength is another. Kind of squirreliness, defined as your ability to get out of a bad position, whether it's against the fence or on the mat.
Sure.
I think that changes dramatically.
Agility,
but also,
you could say.
Yeah, agility for sure. The big one, and I don't know how to put this without sounding kind of dumb. So I'm just going to explain the thing.
Okay.
Is the volume of space that you're capable of taking up in the cage changes as the weight class changes. Right. So it is way easier to be a pressure fighter at heavyweight when a kick can cut off some substantial volume of the octagon, as opposed to at flyweight or at women's strawweight. It's much harder to cut off the cage when the opponent is smaller and each of your strikes takes up substantially less space, kind of volume wise. If you imagine the kick as the radius of a circle, and you're taking away the radius of that circle, or the area of that circle with your kick, that is smaller than it would be if you're 5'4" than it is for somebody who is 6'3".
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought of that.
So it just kind of changes the kinds of games that you can play. Like you spend more time kind of up against or close to the cage. You spend more time there at heavyweight than you do at flyweight.
Yeah, definitely. For me, I have a little list of attributes here that I think are heavily affected by weight. There are 3 of them that are high. The sliders are turned up at 125 and way low at 265, and then 2 of them that I can think of, in very broad terms, that are high at heavyweight and low at flyweight. Stamina, high for small fighters, low for big fighters. Carrying weight around, it just tires you out. Like everyone at heavyweight has bad knees, bad ankles. They don't want to get out of their goddamn easy chair, but they have to earn a paycheck, and that's the only reason they're in the octagon right now. You can tell. Flyweight's not the same thing. You can just constantly be moving, even big dynamic movements, substantially less exhausting, simply because the fighters are moving and lifting less weight. Speed, obviously, as you noted, high at flyweight, low at heavyweight. Durability is relatively much, much higher in lower divisions relative to the power of opponents than it is at 265. And then the other ones that actually are positively affected by weight increase, power and strength, how hard you can hit and how difficult you are to move, or how effective you are at moving other people around, are obviously much, much higher. The heavier you are, they are directly affected by size and weight. So how does that change tactics? I really like that point about just the length of limbs actually making a serious difference, that just generally being a larger fighter is going to allow you to be a more effective pressure fighter. I think, though, for a lot of things, a lot of these attributes, there's like an inverse relationship between where you find them most and where they are most effective as a result. Stamina, for example, is highest for the small guys, if we're looking at a very general graph, and lowest for the big guys. I think you could say then stamina becomes relatively more important at heavyweight than it is at flyweight. Everyone at flyweight has good stamina. You're not going to go into any fights expecting your opponents to tire out, or very rarely will you. Whereas at heavyweight, that is a very normal part of game planning, is letting the other guy slow down. The bigger you get, the more likely that gets. How does that, something like that, how does that affect the way that you might approach a heavyweight versus a bantamweight or whatever?
So I think there are 2 ways of looking at this. And one is to look at the tactical aspect, which is what you're saying. And the other is to look at kind of how the landscape of those divisions has played out and the kinds of fighters who have had success there. Because every division is to some extent its own ecosystem. Like fighters move between divisions, sure. But for the most part, divisions are more or less self-contained. And so you see different games being played in different divisions. And I think by looking at the kinds of games that get played successfully there, we can get a good sense for more or less what works. So let's look at the rankings real quick, just as a kind of a proxy for what seems to work there. At heavyweight, the biggest thing is the punch. It is so the guys who have the most success are the ones who manage to find ways to land a big shot, for creating tactical and strategic situations that maximize their chances of doing that. The other aspect to that is exactly the one that you talked about, which is volume and output, right? That heavyweight, you see very clearly, more than you do other classes, this outlier group of guys who can push an insane pace.
Adam Vicherek, who beat Arjun Bular last weekend, you watch his entire career on YouTube, it's just him not getting tired before the other guy does. Mm-hmm. That's the whole reason for his success. Not that he has no skills or whatever, but really his whole career has kind of been getting his ass whooped until the other guy gets tired and he's undefeated. Mm-hmm. So
that is a much more viable kind of metagame to play at heavyweight than it is at other weight classes. Yep. Like Fabricio Verdum made an entire career out of being made his entire late career, the best part of his career, by throwing and doing more than other guys and being tough enough to take punches that came back at him. Mm-hmm. Right. Like that more than any single like particular skill set that he had, that was what defined his game. Stipe, and I think part of the reason that maybe we haven't appreciated Stipe enough is that he combines both of those two things that work really well at heavyweight. He combines the being able to punch you really hard in the face aspect with the not getting tired aspect. Mm-hmm. Stipe really doesn't get tired. He's in incredible shape relative to the guys he's fighting. So with him, you really get somebody who can play both of those games in different ways for different opponents, and it turns out to be really, really effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's this weird thing where, I guess it's not weird, it makes perfect sense, but the environment of the division, the ecosystem, as you put it, is like it informs the styles that work there, both positively and negatively. Like the reason heavyweights, they try to hit each other really hard. And that's just what they naturally do because that's the easiest thing to have success with. In the aggregate, if you're going to fight 100 times against a completely random selection of opponents and you want to have the best chance of winning each time, you will go for a big-ass punch early on if you weigh 260 pounds. It's a pretty reliable way to win fights. You're going to get knocked out as well. You are going to run into some very difficult style matchups, but you're going to knock a lot of people out because you weigh a lot and it's easy to do that.
Yeah. The sheer, like the other aspect to this at heavyweight is, if we want to talk a little bit about the flip side of skill, is that game works better when you don't have a lot of really skilled wrestlers. Everybody at heavyweight knows how to shoot a takedown, but you do not have the kind of depth of chain wrestling skill that you see at a lot of other weight classes.
You don't have any kind of chained skill at heavyweight like you do in other weight classes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, yes, that's true. But especially at heavyweight, like if you know how to stuff a takedown, you can make a lot of progress.
Oh, yeah. Look at Francis Ngannou. Like, he could barely stuff a takedown. He learned how to stop a takedown at the very first level, and it got him to a title shot.
Whereas imagine, just compare that to the Robert Whittaker Yoel Romero fight.
Right.
The level of takedown defense skill that Robert Whittaker showed off in that fight is insane. So we've seen kind of these ecosystems, right? What is the difference between the heavyweight ecosystem and the lightweight ecosystem? Let's take the most talented, deepest division in the UFC. How is it different?
Why do you have to compare heavyweight to the? I think heavyweight against flyweight is fairer. It's not
okay. Well, but no, flyweight is also weird because at that point you've hit the opposite end of the size spectrum where you don't have that many guys. Like the great middle where you have the right sweet spot of talent and not other athletic opportunities that are going to be present for those guys is like 135 to 170. So flyweight is a little weird.
Unfortunately, because, I mean, it's not the case in boxing, where it's truly an international sport, but in MMA, like, it's largely focused in particular, like, European and American areas, so the average people aren't that small.
Yeah. Yeah, you can just ride the height distribution curve and watch and get a good sense for the depth or lack thereof of weight classes in MMA. It's a direct correlation. Mm-hmm. But,
so the question is, what kind of game does lightweight encourage? What does the build of the lightweight fighter encourage in its ecosystem?
And I mean, to me, that answer is versatility because of the depth. That you have to be able to do a lot of different things and do them well. You cannot have glaring holes in your game because somebody will come along who can exploit one of those holes. You need to be able to strike and wrestle to two levels, right? Like you need to have an A game and a B game at lightweight, and you need to be able to stuff exceptionally strong chains of takedowns in ways that you don't at heavyweight.
Yeah, I think there is, in like all of these attributes kind of just slide up and down as you get bigger or smaller. It's generally a fairly straight line, or a predictable one at least. And I think at lightweight, like we're looking at what was I going to say here? Hold on, edit out this pause, Pat, but I have because at flyweight, yes, okay. So like agility goes up as the fighters get lighter. The ability to be, as you put it, squirreliness, which I really like as a measurement of a fighter's abilities. How squirrely are they? Squirreliness definitely goes up as weight goes down. I think you do reach a point at which that can become a problem, or which that is also exploitable in those divisions. Like, for example, we have seen Demetrius Johnson developing a game that is anti-squirrel. That is like, okay, all of these guys are so used to being squirrely that no one even manages to hold them down. What happens if someone can? And we find out they get controlled for long, long portions of the bout. They end up fighting Demetrius Johnson's fight completely.
Exactly. That is such a great point. He built a game based on exploiting transitions in the division where transitions happen the most often.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I had not quite thought about it as a division specific thing, but that's exactly right.
It's part of, like, not just his skill, but part of why I think in his division in particular, his top control is so dominant and effective. Mm-hmm. These are not fighters who ever get controlled. Mm-hmm. Very rarely.
Yeah, because it's like, it's not that hard to kick a 140-pound guy off you.
Right.
And create just enough space if you're fast enough to scramble back to your feet.
Exactly.
The bar for doing that, as opposed to kicking a 260-pound guy off you, it's a much different kind of situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, all of these ecosystems are different and they all demand different things from you. And what's really striking to me, and this is something we talked about a little earlier with Bantamweight and Sterling and Johns, is that, like, at oh shoot, something went wrong with the audio feed. Can you hear me?
Yeah. I don't know if it's okay. We've got it fixed now. Hold on.
Wait, I hear like a weird. Oh, there it is. Okay. Better.
Stopped it. There we go. Sorry about that.
Okay, sorry about that.
I think it was me. I think it was my mixer because the cat knocked it off. Because everything comes back to the cats. But
generally does.
You were saying you mentioned Brett Jones, I think.
Yeah. Yes. So. Yeah, well, we talked a little bit about the landscape of that division when we talked about Brett Johns and Aljamain Sterling, and how Sterling's game, like, Sterling could maybe play that game even at lightweight much more effectively than he can at bantamweight. But at bantamweight, because of kind of the format of the division, it has encouraged a really high level of striking skill, and it happens to feature a bunch of kind of freakishly talented knockout artists despite the lack of size. So that makes the kind of game that Aljamain Sterling wants to play much riskier when you're confronted with talented, gifted counterpunchers who can literally finish you with a single shot. It's much different playing that game there than it would be, say, at lightweight, or at middleweight. Like, you can imagine Aljamain Sterling riding those skill sets to a title shot against Robert Whittaker.
Oh my God, he'd be middleweight champion. Yeah, absolutely.
Except for Whittaker. Whittaker, I think, could suss out and play that game.
Sure.
But yeah, or at welterweight now, like, that would be a tough game for a lot of guys at welterweight to deal with. But at bantamweight is rough. And occasionally you can see the way a divisional ecosystem develops around its champions. Like, you saw that a lot at welterweight when GSP was the longtime champion. Like, and we talked to Stephen Wright about this many, many years ago on the show, and about how he trained Johnny Hendricks to beat George St. Pierre.
From the beginning of his career, he was training to beat GSP.
And guys like Chris Weidman, who trained from the beginnings of their careers to beat Anderson Silva.
Did TJ Dillashaw train for a long time to beat Dominic Cruz?
Yeah. I mean, and so we see that in kind of the trickle-down effect that has on the rest of the division. Like, Dillashaw's game, in terms of its layers and its depth and its volume and its switch-ups and its angles, has had a kind of a trickle-down effect on the rest of that division. It's had an effect on Cody Garbrandt. It's had an effect on Aljamain Sterling. What you see around you and what you prepare to fight is going to have an effect on kind of the broader ecosystem in which you exist.
Yeah. It's like, well, like with any kind of thing where you're looking at trends or broad statistics, like, the outliers are where the fun is. And the outliers are where things get interesting. And like, Cruz is one of those outliers. He causes like a wrinkle in his division where, like, for example, if you look at takedown percentages per division, it like, Cruz is a huge outlier among the rest of his peers. The bantamweight division has seen a lot more effective takedowns and ground control than others because of Cruz's wrestling. And like things like that can change. It's weird because the style or the ecosystem, as we've put it, that kind of determines a division is the fighters don't come up with this. And sometimes it's not just determined by size. It is determined by other figures in that division or by the history of how it's developed, how people that size have been taught to fight. Maybe not the best way for them to fight. But it's weird. It's like learning a language where like you don't think of the words you're saying. You don't come up with words when you learn to speak. You just absorb them. And fighters at bantamweight absorb a bantamweight way of fighting. Just like fighters at heavyweight absorb a heavyweight way of fighting. That's how their opponents fight. That's how they fight. They just fall into it. And I think it's cool because that's why the outliers are so interesting. The outliers, typically they specifically address what is wrong with the ecosystem of their division. What is wrong with the style that has been encouraged without ever really being thought about or planned, just the style that belongs in this division. How can it be exploited? And so, yeah, as we said, like control being super important for Demetrius Johnson, pace and pressure being super important for Cain Velasquez. You could even get into the real nitty gritty of like how valuable are body shots for a heavyweight versus for a lower weight fighter, with stamina being such a big factor. How much riskier is it to go for a shot takedown rather than a clinch takedown when the guy sprawling on you weighs, almost 300 pounds? Things like that change, but the outliers are really fun. The outliers are the guys who, I don't know, they're innovators, they're disruptors, to use that word, but they are truly the ones who disrupt the way a division is supposed to work. And I just like thinking about this kind of stuff. I think this is a topic that will necessarily bleed into a lot of others and will come up again and again, time after time. But I just wanted to get into it a little bit and talk specifically about how weight determines the way you fight and maybe also the way you should fight and the way people are going to try to fight against you. So that's that. And that is this week's episode of Heavy Hands. Before we go, Pat, what do you have coming out this week, my friend?
I do not have a single dang thing coming out this week. I'm working on a lot of different projects right now. I've got 2 episodes coming on the Protestant Reformation in May. I have an episode for Tides of History. I have 2 episodes on the Protestant Reformation. I have an episode that's kind of a bird's eye view of Europe in 1346. So we'll kind of zoom in on various spots and get a sense for what things looked like and what society looked like on the eve of the Black Death. Then the first week of May, I have an episode coming on that's just about books. That's just about some of my favorite works of popular history that I think people will enjoy, why I like them, and why I think they're valuable for people to read. So I've got a lot of stuff coming on Tides of History, but nothing this week.
Love the reading list idea. I know I have asked you for many, many reading suggestions over the years.
Dude, we're going to be doing a lot more of them. We have a presenting sponsor, and so I'm going to be doing like 3 or 4 of them in the next few months. Nice. Where I just talk about a bunch of books that I think people will like.
I mean, it's got to be kind of fun to be able to actually like discuss the research you're doing and not just use it.
It's not even research, though I'll talk a little bit about some of the books I used for research, but it's mostly just what do I like. For me, history is both my job and it's also I would read popular history for fun anyway.
Yeah.
So like, what are the kinds of things that I enjoy? I've read a shitload of popular history about a lot of different topics over the years, and so it's nice. That's the number one thing that people ask me is like, what would you suggest that I read? So I figured I would formalize that a little bit.
All right. Well, I'm in the same situation, except with all the success and ideas coming to fruition. I'm just working on some projects right now. I got some videos in the works still. I got an article in the works. Things coming along. I don't know, Pat.
Nice.
It's not nice. It's all over. The career's winding down for me. I'm really reaching the end of my run. I'm hoping I can have like a Frankie Edgar-esque last phase where people are like, wow, his articles are only 200 words long now, but they're much punchier than they used to be. He's really choosing his words carefully now, but that probably won't happen. So this is the last episode of Heavy Hands. We thank you all for listening. And if you would like to give us your questions, comments, or concerns, please do that on social media. Twitter is usually the best place for that. Find us both on there. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman, and I am at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. You can also find us both on Facebook, just facebook.com/our name, and then the letters MMA. That is both of our addresses. Find our work elsewhere. You can find my stuff on Bloody Elbow. Make sure you check out Tides of History. check out the damn reading list, okay? You need to read some more popular history. You need to educate yourself, okay? Look at your life, take stock, and improve it. And this is one way. And until that happens, and until next time, thank you so much for tuning in. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.